folks to come in.
Here's Lou.
Lou and Linda here. Paige, who you work with. Welcome and thank you all for being here. It is a great pleasure to welcome the legendary dancer and writer Carolyn Brown, and an equal pleasure to welcome her new book, the eagerly awaited Chance and Circumstance, 20 Years with Cage and Cunningham. I'm tempted to call it a small masterpiece because I know people who have read it enthralled in one evening. I, for one, am happy that at 600 pages, it will take me a bit longer. In any case, it is the most enthralling book I've read on the creative life of what is arguably the most exciting and innovative era in 20th century arts. I'm talking about New York, 1950 through 1970, a time when painters, poets, composers, and choreographers were meeting on what Carolyn memorably writes as the common ground of search and experimentation. It was during this period that Carolyn was a leading dancer with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, Merce's muse, and the period that she writes about with all the beauty and complexity of a Milan Kundera novel. And I'll tell you why I thought I'm not just saying that, I actually have reasons for saying that. For a dancer studying and performing as I was in the 70s and 80s, no dancer epitomized Merce's feeling of dance as a spiritual exercise in physical form more than Carolyn. Her dancing possessed an ethical and moral force that the greatest artists somehow carry in their very technique. I'm thinking of a Pablo Casals, a Fontaine, an Olivier, and Eric Brune. Carolyn had this quality, and her dancing could truly, in the words of John Cage, sober and quiet the mind. He was talking about his own music. I applied it to Carolyn's dancing. And I might add, her dancing could quicken the pulse. Today we are fortunate in having with us in the audience, actually here, another great artist who danced with Carolyn in the late 50s in the Cunningham Company, specifically in two great Cunningham works, Septet and Nocturnes, both with music of Eric Satie. I'd like to introduce to you Dan Wagner, who will share his thoughts about Carolyn and introduce her further. Dan.
Say little and let others discover you like Tibet, or say nothing and avoid discovery altogether. Live in a cave on the side of a mountain and die taking the mountain with you. I like that poem because it makes me think about how beautiful and powerful words are. And I think this afternoon will probably be very rich with a lot of wonderful words and ideas. For 2 years I've been teaching at Florida State University, and last year in late winter I went into Borders bookshop and we looked on the dance shelf. It was way in the back of a huge building and only 3 or 4 books on it. But I saw this generous book and I thought, gee, that's a handsome looking book. And then I saw it was by Carolyn Brown, and I gasped out loud. I knew that the book was in the works, and I snatched it up, bought it, took it home, and I could hardly stop reading. I had to teach my classes. I got so engrossed. It just travels beautifully. I couldn't believe it. I had no idea she wrote so well. But anyway, back to those words. There are lots of wonderful words, aren't there? Indeterminacy, randomness, chaos, chance, I Ching, all the people, Gordon Mumal, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, David Tudor, Nick Cernovich, Remy Charlotte, Viola Farber, all of these wonderful people. And then when I first went to New York, I went from Appalachia, and I met these people. And I didn't quite know what all of this was about, but I knew it just thrilled the hell out of me, and I knew I wanted to be part of that. But those are all very magical words, I think. Musicians, composers, choreographers, dancers, writers, painters, Bob Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, just an incredible list of people that are in this book and are written very accurately about because Carolyn was there. They were friends, they worked together. And so it just is marvelous, the information that's in it. I think that this book will probably be a wonderful reference for art history teachers, dance history teachers. It's very succinct. She explains so many interesting ideas about the theories and the push and the pull of who believed what or wanted what. And it's absolutely fascinating in that way. But of course the main thing is the book. And the book is like literature for me. It was like a novel. It was like a wonderful big Russian novel with characters and demi-characters and plots and subplots and protagonists and antagonists. And then through that is the touring, the traveling. And she must have kept meticulous notes because it is so accurate and so complete. And you get the feeling, Peggy Guggenheim's in Venice and at the La Fenice theater there, wonderful feeling for all of these places and all of these people. And along with that, there's a gracefulness in the book, which is, I don't know, it touched me. I was very touched by it. She writes both about the difficult times, the triumphs and the difficult times, the heartbreak, the abrasiveness, the pain of things. But she writes it so clearly and from, honestly, I think there's an authenticity about it. And so it comes out. There's no acrimony, there's no cynicism, but she says exactly what happened. And you get all a good taste of the feeling of like a good poem, a poet said, a good line of poetry should resonate and should ring in heaven and ring in hell. And the book does that in a way. It really has depth and bite to it. I think all of this comes from the fact that it's very authentic, that Carolyn wrote it with tremendous honesty as she saw it, and that it's her passion for dance and her passion for life that makes it take fire and makes it be a novel, I think, and come to life. It's just absolutely delightful that she has taken the time to do all of that, put that into a wonderful, thrilling novel, and to make that happen. If I've met you once, I'll meet you twice. We'll say hello, goodbye till all the clocks break down. When everything seems possible, very little will do nicely. This book is my friend. There are others, but this one's my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Carolyn Brown.
Well, I really should go home now. Thank you, Richard. It's so beautiful and so moving. Of course, you named the one dancing artist that moved me so deeply, which was Margot Fontaine. This man was a great dancer with Paul Taylor. We wanted him in Cunningham Company. But he was also in Martha Graham's company. And, you know, we were starving and they were doing better. So he had to eat, after all. It turns out that your partner, George, we went back in family files and discovered that somewhere about 100 years ago we were related.
Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start off by saying I never, and this may come as a shock to particularly these young people here who are dancers, and I'm sorry you have to stand. I never wanted to be a dancer. I never intended to be a dancer. I wanted to be a writer. And so when I went off to college, I left my dancing clothes behind. Now, I happened to be born, this is my home state, by the way. I was born in Fitchburg, Mass. I went to school in Fitchburg. I went to Wheaton College in Norton, Mass. It was not until I was 22 years old that I left Massachusetts. My mother, I started dancing at the age of 3 with my mother, Marion Stevens Rice, who was, never knew there was such a thing as a name for a dance step. As a little kid, she created her own dances. She taught all the neighborhood kids. In fact, if they didn't do it, she dragged them in. She gave shows, she made the costumes, she made the shoes, she did everything. It wasn't until she went off to Solon's College, when she was probably 17 or 18, she discovered in a ballet class that steps she knew and made up had names. And from that time, she was totally devoted to dance. And she came She didn't stay in college very long because she was being pursued by my father. And she married the man, and he happened to see Ruth St. Denis' performance in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And he said to her, "That's where you should go. That's who your teacher should be." And it just happened that the Bragiati Denishon School opened in Boston probably in the late teens, and here we have a historian here who probably knows all these things, but certainly in the early 20s, which is when my mother was studying, both with Ted Shawn and with the people from the Denishon group. So I started to dance willy-nilly, no choice here, at 3 years old. And my first performance was my own choreography, which extended to being carried on stage by my dad. This is an outdoor performance, by the way, in a crepe paper flower. And I got up and I waved back and forth and I went down to my flowers. So that was my first performance. Anyway, from that time on until I left for college, I danced morning, noon, and night. My mother was a passionate teacher, a brilliant teacher for children, which some of you here will know. But her passion was not transferable to me. I wasn't passionate about dancing. In fact, I knew I didn't want to be a dance teacher because I used to do it in her studio, and it wasn't a choice. It was something, you take this class. The thing I hated most was teaching ballroom. It's a little old bald-headed man who came up to you right here. So I was going to major in philosophy and go off to college and be an intellectual. So I did, and 2 weeks later I called my mom and said, "Please send my dance clothes immediately." So for 4 years I did the dancing, and in the 40s, I'm talking now, before all of you were born, 1946, I guess, from graduation, 1950. The dance in the colleges at that time was abysmal. There was a little smattering of Graham, a little smattering of whatever. And there was no major in dance, so you just did it. But I choreographed, and it never occurred to me that it wasn't okay to choreograph the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky or anything like that. I just thought, my mother used to do this, and the Russian novelists were my favorite, so. And my Russian teacher thought, I don't think I want to come to see this. He didn't say that, but I could tell in his eyes. But he came, and he was unoffended and said, "I think I'll introduce you to some people." He was a white Russian who had escaped Russia. So I was a little bit, encouraged. I still intended to be a writer. I'm going to jump now to the man I married to 2 weeks after I graduated from college. His name is Earl Brown, composer. He was born in Lunenburg, Mass. And where he came from in terms of his artistic aspirations, I have the slightest idea, because his father was the postmaster of the town. His mother was a housewife. And to his knowledge, there were no musicians or anything in the family. But at a very young age, he started playing the trumpet, having his own jazz band. My brother played drums. I'll introduce my niece, Rebecca Rice Flanagan, who is a choreographer, dancer, and also grew up from the time she was 3 doing Denishon dances. Where was I?
Earl Brown had become a musician.
And so Parker, her father, played drums in his band. And then he went into the Army Air Corps, and this was the very end of the Second World War. And he started to learn about other kinds of music, but he had already fallen in love with Bartok very early in his youth. I don't know what the genes were about Earl. He's a mystery to me. That suddenly he was knowing all about Baudelaire and French culture and Gertrude Stein and all of these things that I knew nothing about. And yet, at my mother's funeral, there was a party afterwards, or a reception, whatever you call it, and he said to, I think to Rebecca, or to my father, I mean my brother, her father, that he learned all about art from my mother. And I don't know how that came about, except that, of course, we danced to all the great classics. We danced to Beethoven, and Schumann, and Schubert, and Chopin, and all of this music. And so he was introduced to that. And he knew about the passion for art from my mother, certainly. But he never, ever said that to me. So that was very new. Anyway, 2 weeks after college, we got married and we headed west. He went to the Schillinger House of Music in Boston, which now is another name, but it's a place where jazz musicians go mostly. The Berkeley School, yeah. And he was going to try to be a composer, but also teach the Schillinger system of composition and arrangement. And we ended up, and I won't go, it's too long a story because the book tells it all. But anyway, when we got married, we ended up in Denver, Colorado, and he started teaching, and I had absolutely nothing to do except write. That's what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to write. But I hadn't lived a life that had anything to talk about, to write about. So I did write a few things. I even reviewed a Martha Graham concert with Judith, and I'd send it in and come back. Anyway, Earl said, "You need to dance." I think he just wanted me out of his hair. And so he actually even found the studio, and that's how, in a very long, long-winded story, how I eventually met Merce Cunningham and John Cage. They were on a tour, just the two of them, and John was playing his sonatas and interludes, and Merce was giving concerts whenever anyone could afford to present him. But presenting a dance concert is more expensive than a music concert. So he taught 3 classes. I took those 3 classes. I don't say this in the book, but Earl tells this story that when I went across the floor, he muttered, "There's a dancer." Well, I still didn't believe that that's what I was. But I was absolutely riveted by Cage, and we sort of sat at his feet for several parties, particularly just Earl and me. And this man is the reason I'm a dancer, because he was the most, he's a born guru, John Cage. I say is because I cannot believe he isn't here. He died in 1992. But he was so inspirational and had such an open mind and such enthusiasm for life and all aspects of life, and knew so much about art, and he had been studying about Zen Buddhism, and he had studied about Indian culture, and this is just mind expanding. If you've lived in New England all your life, and I don't know how many of you here have, but this is truly mind expanding for someone. But I still didn't intend to be a dancer. It never would have occurred to me to do that. But Earl was thrilled, and we decided we would move to New York, which we did, and that's sort of the beginning of what happened. And once again, people think I'm a real nitwit, but once again, I was going to go to Columbia and get my master's in philosophy, and eventually maybe a doctorate and maybe teach. And why you think you can teach philosophy when you don't know anything about it. But if you read this fantastic book, not mine, there is the most brilliant biography of William James, who is our local brilliant man here in this state. His education was very spotty, but he started writing articles about psychology and physiology and all kinds of things, and he knew almost nothing. But it was coming from an original mind. And that's what I was meeting with John Cage. He was an original mind. And so Earl said, don't go to Columbia. Really, this isn't where you want to go. I think he knew I was no intellectual. So Juilliard had just opened. It was in its second year. So I went to Juilliard. What you have to understand in the 50s, for those of you who weren't even born yet, was that it was a very, very conventional, and all the rest of this country, a very conventional, you know, it was called the Eisenhower years. They were very staid, everyone was very proper. I came from that kind of family. And there had been this explosion in the art world in the late 40s when many of the European artists escaped from the war to come here and work. But what happened in the 50s is the creativity was no longer European coming here, but was American born. John Cage is absolutely, I was having this conversation with Marcia the other day, and I don't mean to say he was a typical American at all, atypical, but he is like, trying to think who I want to say. Well, like Gertrude Stein, who is American to the core. John came from the West Coast. Merce came from the West Coast. They weren't as affected by Oriental culture. I mean, sorry, just the reverse of European culture there. There was a more of an Oriental culture influence there. But neither of them were tied to European thought. And what was happening at that time when Merce was probably in his early 30s by then, and had danced with Martha Graham for 5 years, but had been encouraged by John to step out on his own. And John was exploring all these new ideas, which are too deep to go into this talk, but at the same time that he was doing that, there were these very, very young painters like Bob Rauschenberg and later Jasper Johns, who met each other at Black Mountain College. The Merce Cunningham Company was born in 1953 at Black Mountain. I went to Juilliard for a year. At the end of that year, and I was also studying with Merce. At the end of that year, Merce had been invited to Black Mountain and could take some dancers with him, and I was one of the ones invited to go. And the whole history of Black Mountain, although it's only about a 25-year history, was again a place where creative artists were creating totally new ways of thinking about things. A lot of the early influence was from Europe, but there were all these young artists, and that's where Rauschenberg met Cage and Cunningham. So there was this ferment of ideas, and what was exciting for me was the totality, the wholeness of this life. It wasn't like, and I don't mean to offend anyone here, but it wasn't like going to class and doing your pliés and then going out to lunch and talking about how fat you are and that your leg didn't get as high as so-and-so's and you couldn't do triple turns. That wasn't my life. My life was ideas about art, about life, about philosophy, and John was just one bubbling fountain of he loved, and he was contradictory. He contradicted himself all over the place. You know, that's what you said yesterday. Yeah, well, now I think this. So you read this William James thing. I haven't finished it, but it's a brilliant book. And the same thing. He was trying to find out, you know, about life, about God, about very serious issues. But one day he'd be here, and the next day, 2 days later, he'd be there. And that's how you can expand. If you're